Welcome to ECAN's webinar series. We have a very interesting topic today. We're talking about catching esophageal cancer before it starts. And our guest today is Dr. Lishan Aklog. He is the founder and CEO of PAVmed, which is the parent company of Lucid Diagnostics. And Lucid Diagnostics makes the new EsoGuard DNA test and EsoCheck device that can quickly and easily detect Barrett's esophagus. And Dr. Aklog actually has a very interesting story of his own. He is a cardiac surgeon, Harvard educated. And Dr. Aklog, if you could tell us a little bit about how you ended up where you are today and why this issue of stopping esophageal cancer matters to you.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Mindy, for the invitation and for all the great work that you and ECAN do. And it's a great honor to be here with everybody. So as you mentioned, I had a previous life where I was a practicing cardiothoracic surgeon. I did mostly heart surgery, but I trained in general thoracic surgery as well, which is the specialty that deals with the esophagus and with patients with advanced forms of esophageal disease, including esophageal cancer. My history in terms of where I am today, which is not where I had expected to be 20 years ago, is that me and some of my partners have always been interested in advancing in innovation and trying to come up with better ways to do things, of sort of showing up to work every day and saying, how could we do things better? And that mostly took the form when we were practicing of improving surgical techniques or working with companies who had new technologies to develop new ways of doing things. But that bug sort of started working its way into coming up with our own innovations, and we had a few successes in doing that. And then ultimately, me and one of the other co-founders of this company, another cardiothoracic surgeon, Dr. de Guzman, decided to give up our clinical practice and become medical device entrepreneurs full-time. And so we've been doing that for the last 6 years or so. We founded this company, PAVmed, which has multiple products in its portfolio, and the most exciting of which are the two products that you mentioned, which are held in a subsidiary that we created 2 years ago. And I'll be talking a little bit more about the history of that a little bit later.
So it's interesting to me because apart from your work as a physician and your work as a developer of inventions and progress for a lot of patients around the world, you also are involved in other philanthropic activities as well, other ways of making the world a better place. Do you have a minute to take us on
Sure.
that?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's nice of you to bring that up. So I have the honor and privilege of serving on the International Board of Human Rights Watch, and I think it's interesting that you link them, because it really does come down to figuring out ways to help people. And one of the things that people ask me about what I currently do compared to doing surgery is, do I miss the opportunity to have an impact on patients by being a surgeon and doing dramatic things to help patients get better? And my answer to that is, yeah, that was a unique form of having an impact, and very gratifying and rewarding on a one-on-one basis. But it's really qualitatively different, but in some ways the same, to have that impact by developing products to help people more broadly. And in some ways you can have a greater impact. Some of the products that we created 8-9 years ago are continuing to save lives to this day, and that has a great impact. So I think it's appropriate for you to extrapolate some of my other activities with Human Rights Watch, which is the premier human rights watch organization in the world, and is in 140 countries, and seeks to defend human dignity and human rights through amazing work all over the world. So I suppose they're sort of shades of the same instinct. So as Mindy mentioned, I'm the chairman and CEO of PAVmed, Inc., which is a parent company of Lucid Diagnostics. And the goal of this talk is to give you a background on the disease state of esophageal adenocarcinoma, or esophageal cancer, and its precursors, but also some of the new technologies that we've developed, which we think facilitate the diagnosis of these conditions, and we think will save lives in the long term. So I'm just going to go to the slide here. This is our leadership team that we have put together for the parent company, for PAVmed. And I won't go back and repeat the history of how we started this, but I want to tell you a little bit about the underlying vision of this company, which is to bring in, either develop new innovations or bring in innovations that are being developed at other institutions, particularly academic medical centers and others, and to move them through a process of research and development, advancing them through all the regulatory steps that you need to take, and bringing them to patients and physicians in a rapid and cost-efficient way. And so, as you'll see from the history of the technology I'm going to talk about today, it really follows that vision, where we identified a technology that we thought had a great opportunity, both from a commercial, but also more importantly from a patient impact point of view, and sort of pounced on it, have really been able to move it through the process very quickly. So these are our portfolio. As you can see, it's actually pretty diverse. What we're going to talk about today is in the GI health space, and we focus on EsoGuard and EsoCheck, which are two commercially available products that are helping patients today with gastroesophageal reflux disease to protect them from the development of Barrett's esophagus, esophageal cancer. We also have a technology which we hope we can offer to patients sometime by the middle of next year, which completes sort of an integrated suite of products to allow us to treat the conditions that evolve from Barrett's esophagus prior to developing cancer. So not just diagnosing early, but allowing this monitoring process to pick up conditions that can be treated before they advance to full-blown cancer. And then you can see we have other areas. We're working in carpal tunnel syndrome. We're trying to come up with better ways to provide infusions for patients, and a series of other emerging projects on the right. So Lucid Diagnostics is one of two operating subsidiaries of the parent company, PAVmed. And it all started with this paper here. So if you wind the clock back to January of 2018, we were contacted by University Hospitals Cleveland, a physician. Actually, it's always a good story behind this. It was a former colleague of mine when I was at Harvard Medical School. He was an interventional cardiologist. I was a cardiac surgeon, and we'd worked together, and his career had sort of skyrocketed, and now he was the president of the entire University Hospitals Medical Center in Cleveland. And he had actually called me 6 months earlier. He knew about PAVmed and said, hey, I have these brilliant faculty members whose pictures you can see there, who have developed some very interesting technologies in the diagnostic space. And we said we'd look at it, but we weren't doing a lot in diagnostics. We were mostly doing devices. And at the time, it seemed a bit premature. So he called me back in January of 2018 and emailed a copy of this article that was just recently published. That was published literally that day. And it was published in Science, Translational Medicine, for those of you who know much about sort of medical research. It's sort of the premier. It's like being in the New York Times or the Washington Post or some other premier publication. So that immediately got our attention. And what we found is that the faculty members, Dr. Markowitz, who's a cancer geneticist, Dr. Schock, who's a gastroenterologist, Dr. Willis, who's a pathologist, and Dr. Moynova, who's a molecular geneticist as well, had developed two things. They developed a molecular diagnostic test, as well as a tool to sample the esophagus. And the highlight of this article is in the bottom right, which basically can be summarized as saying that they found they had a 90% success, greater than 90% success and accuracy at detecting Barrett's esophagus from samples collected from the lower esophagus. And we'll talk a little bit more about what Barrett's esophagus actually means. So we were very excited about this. He called back and said, hey, what do you think? Do you want to have a call? And we said, nope, we'll be there on Monday. And so it took we were a small team at the time. We took our entire team and showed up and booked a full day. And we're actually quite proud because other larger companies were looking at this and were sniffing around. And we made the case that, no pun intended, since it's Case Western, we made the case that we would be the best partners to develop this. And it's actually it's important to understand why, because innovators, I mean, this technology is their babies. They've been working on this, you can think of it as their children. They've been working on this for decades, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And what they want more than anything was to make sure that this became available for patients. And we presented them with a model that assured that we weren't going to do potentially what some larger companies sometimes do, which is to take interesting technology to sort of say, this is kind of hard. We've got other things to do, and sort of put it on the shelf. And we structured it and made a commitment that we would work tirelessly to get this product so it was available to the benefit of patients.
Lishan, I want to interrupt for just a minute.
Please,
to say that, ECAN has, Dr. Markowitz and Dr. Schock are good friends of ECAN's, and we have been monitoring their progress. And actually, I had the honor of serving on the SPORE committee, which is the Specialized Programs of Research Excellence that NCI funds. And so I was able to be supportive of this as they were starting the project. But the thing that you just mentioned was the thing that was most critical to me, and I think for our patients, that we've seen some interesting technology that people talked about for a long time, but somehow it never seems to come to patients. And so that fast track to get it to folks and start saving lives was really critical to us. And we were really glad to see the speed at which this progress happened.
Right. And I mentioned earlier, and I'll reiterate it, that's really in our DNA. The way we created this company, and I won't go into the nuances of how this agreement was structured, but it was structured in a very unique way. It's not a traditional licensing agreement between a commercial company and an academic medical center. And we've structured the business to come up with a streamlined way to bring in what we consider to be a lot of trapped innovations that are stuck at academic medical centers that just can't get out into the commercial world. And we've come up with a novel, very much win-win, tightly partnered, with both sides working together to make sure. We just had a 2-hour call last night with all with the people on that call. This is 2 years later. We're still having very deep involvements with them, and so we're actually very proud of the fact that we were able to secure this, but also that it's worked out so well in terms of the speed to which it's been brought to become available to patients. So PAVmed and Case Western joined forces. We signed a license agreement. We created Lucid Diagnostics and brought the two technologies, which didn't have names yet, but we now have commercialized them as EsoGuard, which is the DNA test, and EsoCheck, which is the cell collection device. Just want to highlight something you sort of hinted at here on the upper right, which is that and it's important, as everybody on this call is, I assume, a taxpayer, that this is research. This work has come out of government-sponsored research. So the NIH and through the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, was really supported this work for many years through a consortium of academic centers led by the folks at Case Western. And in fact, we're also proud that the NCI, which has to put a report every year to Congress to ask for more money, where they highlight the advances. They highlighted this as one of just a handful, 2 or 3 advances in cancer prevention in their most recent report to Congress.
And I want to just jump in again for our folks who are patients and advocates. That's one of the reasons why our voices are important, because it's Congress that decides what that budget looks like. And for years, our advocates have been going to Congress and saying this money really matters, and here's a great example of why.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because really, at the early stages when this is just a twinkle in some researcher's eye, where a commercial the commercial potential is not obvious, it does require the taxpayer support to get these ideas off the ground and get them to the point where you've proven that they have a potential to have an impact before they can enter into the commercial and clinical realm. So thank you for that. So the way to look at these two technologies is that they're complementary, and they're designed to detect a spectrum of conditions to diagnose them. And they include Barrett's esophagus, 2 different forms of it, which I'll describe in a second, and esophageal cancer, which is highly lethal, as well as esophageal cancer itself. So they can detect all of the things along that spectrum, and these arise from patients who have chronic esophageal reflux disease or chronic heartburn. So let's talk a little bit about the disease. It starts with gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD. Every disease these days, so if you watch ads from pharmaceuticals on TV, have to have a mnemonic. So this one is GERD, or GERD. And this is commonly known as chronic heartburn. Heartburn is a misnomer, right? Because we think of heartburn, we think it's something to do with your heart and you're having angina or something related to a heart attack, and it's not. So it's a bit of a misnomer, but it's the common term that we use, and it's not related to your heart, it's related to your gastrointestinal tract. This is a huge problem. So 50+ million patients in this country have at least once a week symptoms of GERD or chronic heartburn. It generates 9 million visits per year. And of those 50 million, and we'll break this down a little bit more specifically in a second, 10 to 15 million of them are considered high risk for complications that we'll describe in a second. So a huge problem. Another way, the other way to prove that it's a big problem is just look at how much money and attention we spend on drugs to treat chronic heartburn. So
are these numbers for the U.S. or for the world?
For the U.S., right. So you can easily quadruple it for the rest of the world because it is more common in Western populations, typical Western Europe and U.S. and developed countries, but this is just in the U.S. But what I was going to say is that it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. If you look at historically at advertisements, it was Alka-Seltzer and Tums, and now it's Prilosec and Nexium. You go to the CVS and you look at it, and there's an entire section all with selling products to try to suppress the symptoms of chronic heartburn. Doesn't solve the problem. It just suppresses the symptoms. It makes it so that people.
And that's why ECAN filed a petition several years ago to try to get the FDA to put warning labels on those over-the-counter medications, because so many patients eliminate their symptoms and then one day they can't swallow and no one ever warned them that reflux they had could be dangerous. Right.
So this is, you can cut it in 10 different ways, but this is a huge problem, and that's well established. So what happens? In some subset of patients, the fluid in the stomach, which is designed to be in the stomach, it includes acid and bile and other things, finds its way into the lower esophagus or the lower food tube. And there's normally a well-functioning valve between the stomach and the esophagus that prevents the reflux or regurgitation or movement of gastric fluid back into the esophagus. And the esophagus is not used to that. It's not supposed to see that. It's just supposed to be a conduit for food to go through. And so when the lower esophagus is exposed to this fluid from the stomach, it in effect tries to protect itself. It tries to protect itself from this acid and other more erosive fluids by changing its lining to accommodate it. And so this change, this benign transformation called Barrett's esophagus, can be seen as an attempt to protect itself from the exposure to the acid. And this is a benign condition. In and of itself, it doesn't have any particular complications. It's just a precursor to other more serious things. So if you look at the numbers there are 3 to 4 million patients who are known to have Barrett's esophagus. That's probably a low number because we don't, as you'll see in a second, we don't screen enough. And it represents somewhere between, call it 5% to 7% of patients who have reflux and are considered high risk. So the problem is that this transformation, as in a lot of things in our body, when our body is reacting to try to address a problem with inflammation, it can go awry. And so this transformation that can be benign in a subset of patients, about 1 in 50 per year, it can change to develop precancerous changes. So changes that are referred to as dysplasia, they can be low grade or high grade. So these are stepping stones on the way to a full-blown cancer. So it's important because it tells us where this is heading, but it's also important because it gives us an opportunity, if we can pick it up, to intervene and to stop this process before it can actually progress to something more serious and more lethal. So this happens about 2% per year in patients with non-dysplastic Barrett's, and there are treatments. There is radio frequency or cryo or cold ablation technologies that can be performed during an endoscopy, which is a tube placed down the stomach, where you can essentially burn this superficial layer, abnormal layer, get rid of it so it can't progress to more advanced cancer. So if you're lucky enough to have it picked up at this stage, you have the opportunity to do that. As we'll see, very few people actually are provided with the opportunity. And then these dysplastic precancerous changes can become a full-blown cancer. It's called esophageal adenocarcinoma is the technical name for it. And it can start off as just being in the layers, but more commonly it becomes invasive and patients don't realize they have it until they have pretty advanced symptoms. Either they have pain, or more commonly they have trouble swallowing, and even just sort of their saliva doesn't go down, and it sort of presents itself, very acutely, but you realize that this is something that's been going on for many, many years and has been growing over time without developing symptoms. We'll talk a little bit in more detail about the epidemiology of this, how things have changed over time, but it is a rapidly growing cancer. It's highly lethal, and it's something that has deserved, and obviously you and everybody on this call understand this, really needs more attention directed to it. This is what Barrett's esophagus looks like if you're undergoing an endoscopy. An endoscopy is just sort of a snake with a camera at the end of it. You can take a picture of it. This is what the esophagus looks like. If you look at the pink outer side here, that's what normal esophagus looks like. And the darker areas, it looks actually salmon colored. There's a little tongue extending up here. That's the abnormal, that's the abnormal area that's apparent. You see this appearance, but you have to document it by getting tissue samples and proving that, in fact, this changes Barrett's esophagus and not some other condition. So there are risk factors. Some are unalterable, and unfortunately, we can't alter our age. We keep getting older. Gender, race, and family history. And then there are some lifestyle factors that can come into play, including diet, obesity, smoking, certain medications, and certain bacteria that can be found in the gastrointestinal system that can be eradicated, called H. pylori. The next few slides basically are to demonstrate how the distribution within it by different categories. So here you could see that the incidence of Barrett's esophagus, the precursor, goes up right around sort of 45 to 50. In age, and continues to be high in elderly patients. Although, as Mindy reminded me the other day, it's not zero in younger patients. So just because it starts to peak around 50 and 60, there's still plenty of patients who are in their 20s and 30s who can get this, and that's a real challenge for our system to figure out how to identify those patients. Here's the incidence of cancer as well. It sort of matches the incidence of Barrett's, in that the peak starts to peak around 60. But as you can see, again, there are younger patients who develop this in their 30s, 40s, and even as low as 20. Here are the numbers. They're depressing numbers. 18,000 new cases a year and 16,000 deaths per year. The survival rate is 20% or less. That means 8 out of 10 patients will die within 5 years of diagnosis. And this is really the slide that justifies the work that ECAN is doing and the work we're doing in this space, because the incidence of esophageal cancer has exploded over the last 4 decades, 7-fold. You can see we've either flat or made progress on other cancers at the same time. So there's something going on here that whether it's related to the epidemic of obesity or other factors, maybe even the medications like Prilosec suppressing symptoms, but for whatever reason, this has become a huge, an increasing problem that has to be addressed. It's not just the diagnosis, of course; it's the number of deaths as well. So what do we do? The only way you can prevent cancer and prevent cancer deaths is by picking it up early, in the earlier stages along that spectrum that I mentioned, and doing something about it. So the American College of Gastroenterology, which is one of the premier professional societies for this clinical space, has put out guidelines. These are from 2016. They're still active, and it recommends screening of patients, a subset of patients who have GERD over 5 years with additional risk factors that you can see there: 50-year-old, white, male, obese, smoker, family history. So those are pretty common risk factors. So you can imagine there are a lot of people, which I'll show in a second, that have that should be getting screened. And we'll show the numbers in a second. So what is recommended is that these patients get screened. And why are they getting screened? Why do they recommend screening? They recommend screening so we can pick up Barrett's as a benign condition. We can monitor it through scheduled regular testing and identify those patients who progress to dysplasia. That's the LGD, HGD there. So that can be ablated before they progress to cancer. So that's how you prevent deaths from cancer, is to pick it up early, to follow it, to intervene at a stage where you can obliterate it before it becomes cancer. So what's the problem? The problem is that up until now, we haven't had a good method for screening. The standard approach is an upper endoscopy. It involves inserting a tube in the stomach through the mouth and pulling it back and observing and doing biopsies in the esophagus. It's performed at an ambulatory surgery or endoscopy center. Both the patient and, quote unquote, their ride need to take the full day off. So it's an inconvenience in that regard. And it requires intravenous sedation or anesthesia. So endoscopy has failed as a widespread screening tool for Barrett's esophagus. And I'll give you the numbers in a second. It's just too invasive, costly, and inconvenient to be used in a widespread way. So I promised the numbers. Here are the numbers. So if we start with people who have chronic heartburn, symptoms of GERD, it's about 50 million, call it 46 million. If you take those who are 50 and older, who are the higher risk by age, that goes to 34 million. And then if you add just 2 of those risk factors on that list that I showed you, you're at 31 million patients. That's what you need in order to qualify for screening. That includes a lot of women. So women are at risk for Barrett's esophagus. They actually have slightly more Barrett's esophagus, but they're at decreased risk of it developing to esophageal cancer. So there's that dichotomy there between how often they get Barrett's and how often they get it advances to cancer. But of course, that's not to say that women, particularly higher risk women, don't get cancer. The guidelines are worded most strongly for men. So even if we just start with that, again, I'm not here to suggest that we shouldn't be screening women. I think we should be. But even if you say, take the highest risk group, which are 50-year-old men with another risk factor, it's 13 to 15 million patients should be screened at a minimum. And what we know is that less than 10% of them are being screened. It's somewhere around 7%. So that's the number. So we're not screening enough patients, whether it's out of the 13 million or the 31 million, we're not screening enough patients to have an impact on the prevention of esophageal cancer and deaths from esophageal cancer. So that's where the unmet need is here. If you think of 2 numbers, think of less than 10% and over 80%. So less than 10% of patients who are recommended by the American College of Gastroenterology to be screened are being screened. And another way to look at the 10% number is that if you take the patients who show up and are diagnosed with esophageal cancer, they can't swallow, they get an endoscopy, oh, I'm sorry, you have an esophageal cancer, less than 10% of those patients ever knew that they had Barrett's esophagus or the precursors. The first thing they hear about is, I'm sorry, you have a large advanced esophageal cancer. So there's no other way to describe that but to say it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy because it's a missed opportunity that if that patient had been diagnosed with Barrett's esophagus, there would have been the opportunity to monitor them and to identify when they develop dysplasia and to treat the dysplasia before it developed into lethal cancer. So there's just no other way to describe this. This is a tragedy that needs to be fixed, and that's what we're working on. And then the over 80% is that at the time they're diagnosed, over 80% will die. But if we can increase screening, even from what is now less than 10%, we don't have to get to 100%. Even if we get to 25% in the coming years, that will prevent thousands of deaths from esophageal cancer per year. In order to do that, we have to have widespread screening. We have to get that number up to 25% or 50% or higher. And that requires an efficient and effective, non-invasive, office-based test that's an alternative to endoscopy. People know about colonoscopy because colonoscopy has done a better job of being inserted into prevention regimens. And the screening rate for colonoscopy is not great. It should be 100%, but it's about 60% of patients who are recommended. And the target populations are similar, although now colonoscopy screening is, the age limit has been lowered. So if you compare that 60% to less than 10% for Barrett's esophagus and Barrett's esophagus and esophageal cancer, you can see what an opportunity there is to improve screening for this condition. There are new screening modalities for colon cancer, the most common of which is EsoGuard, which if you watch any TV, you can't miss because they're constantly advertising. And so you should think about the products I'm going to talk about in a second as really analogous to that even though colonoscopy is used 60% of the time, still a lot of patients and a lot of doctors refer patients for EsoGuard, which is a stool DNA test that the patient sends their stool and sends it to a lab and gets diagnosed there. So we have an opportunity to do something similar by providing a non-invasive office-based procedure, not a home procedure, but an office-based procedure to improve that screening rate. And we have actually a greater opportunity because we're starting at such a low number, at less than 10%. Okay, so that's the unmet need. That's what we're here to do. That's our mission, is to provide to address that unmet need and provide widespread screening for these conditions. So let's now dive into the details of the technologies that Lucid has developed and has brought to market. The first is the DNA test, which is called EsoGuard. So again, I go back to the study by our friends at Case Western Reserve, which showed that the test, this EsoGuard assay, which looks at two genes and looks at changes on those two genes to determine through DNA sequencing whether there are abnormalities that are found in those two genes that indicate Barrett's esophagus or the more advanced condition. So I do want to emphasize something, which is that this test is not, even though sometimes it gets labeled, and if you look at the title here, it says Barrett's esophagus. The test actually is quite good, as good at detecting everything from Barrett's on. So if you have Barrett's, if you have dysplasia, low grade, high grade, or esophageal cancer, it's equally effective at picking all of those up. And this is a busy slide, but just to show that that 90% number, if you look on the right here, the 90% number really carries out across all of the subgroups, whether it's SS, short segment, long segment, dysplastic, low-grade dysplastic, high-grade dysplastic, and esophageal cancer. You get really, really nice numbers across the board for all of those conditions. So we took this test and we moved it out of, we did what we said we were going to do, which was we moved it out of a research laboratory at Case Western Reserve University and moved it into a commercial setting. So what does that mean? That means that we transferred it to a commercial laboratory. We have a partner called ResearchDx, which is based in Irvine, California. They're what's called a CLIA CAP certified laboratory. Those are the certifying organizations by the government that say you're allowed to go and do tests, whether it be various types of blood tests or genetic tests and so forth. And the process of getting a test from a research laboratory to a setting that it can be offered to patients is not trivial. It requires a lot of validation work and compliance work and testing and standard operating procedures and all sorts of metrics that need to be done before it can be certified for use in humans in a clinical setting. So that work spanned about 1.5 years from the time we did the license, and in December of 2019, that work was completed and EsoGuard became available as what's called a laboratory developed test. ResearchDx also manufactures the little kits that the physicians use in their office to send the sample to the lab. So this is what it looks like. So the physician, I'll show later how the sample is collected, but once the sample is collected, it's put into a vial. There's a requisition form, there's a requisition form that is filled out, and it's sent into a packaged mailer which has postage on it, which is sent to the laboratory, and the laboratory performs this complex molecular genetic test and generates a binary result. The binary result is shown here. This is what the physician would get. It's a report. You can see it says test result, either positive or negative. If it's positive, then it says that it suggests that you have something either starting at Barrett's esophagus on the spectrum to esophageal cancer, and it recommends a confirmatory EGD, or upper endoscopy, to confirm the diagnosis and then put the patient, if it is confirmed to be positive, in a testing regimen where they get an endoscopy regularly to monitor the progression to dysplasia. If it's negative, then generally they're left alone, and it's assumed to be negative, and follow-up is based on their patient's symptoms or other clinical characteristics. Right now, there's about a 3-week turnaround from the time the sample is collected until the patient gets the result. As volume picks up, that number will decrease to about a 5-day turnaround.
Dr. Aklog, when they get the results of the test, it just says positive or negative. It won't say that you've detected cancer or high-grade dysplasia or any of those.
Right. I should have explained that a little more deep. That's why you need the endoscopy. So all this can tell you is that you either have Barrett's, low-grade dysplasia, high-grade dysplasia, or cancer. It doesn't tell you which one. And so that's why you need an endoscopy to confirm which one. And based on where it is, if it's non-dysplastic Barrett's, then you'll just be monitored. If it shows dysplasia, increasingly for both types of dysplasia, you'll get an ablation procedure to destroy the dysplasia and prevent it from evolving to cancer. If it detects cancer, hopefully it detects it at an earlier stage where it's still within the lining of the esophagus. And some of those patients can be treated with a less invasive procedure where you effectively strip the lining of the esophagus if it hasn't penetrated all the way through the wall. Obviously, if it's penetrated through the wall, that typically will require surgery and chemotherapy. Okay, so that's the diagnostic test. Let's talk a little bit about the collection device, which is what the patient experiences. So the device is called EsoCheck, and it looks pretty simple. Here it is. It has, if you start on the downstream end, the distal end, it has a little balloon here, which we'll show a little more in a second. It's got a capsule. It's got a silicone catheter attached to a stopcock, and there are these 2 syringes that are used to manipulate the inflation and deflation of the balloon. This is a close-up view, and you can see when the balloon is inflated, it has these ridges on it that are proprietary and allows the esophagus allows this device to sample, basically swab cells from the esophagus. And the brilliant side here, I didn't invent this, so I can say that. The brilliance of Dr. Schock and his team is that they came up with a way to do this where you can get the cells in the area that you need to look for. And then for the rest of the trip out of the patient, the sample is protected. So once you've sampled it, you deflate the balloon, and that balloon gets pulled into the capsule here. And all the cells that are on the outside surface of the balloon here are pulled into the capsule. And so you collect and then you protect the sample so it's not contaminated by other cells in the middle and upper esophagus and the mouth and the spit and other things, right? And so it gives you a very protected, targeted sample, which is pretty hard to do unless typically you need to do an endoscopy or need to do surgery to do a targeted sampling of tissue. And this is a clever, simple office-based way to do it without an endoscopy. The actual capsule is quite small. It's smaller than a daily vitamin or a gel cap. And there are markings on this so the physician or nurse can tell where the capsule is based on the distance from the mouth. Here's how it's done. So let me show you a quick breakdown of the steps, and then I'll show a short animation. So the steps are: the patient swallows the capsule in its collapsed state here, as attached to this tether. Once it's determined to be in the stomach by the distance, the balloon is inflated, so those ridges are exposed. The ridges are pulled back along just the lower esophagus, because that's where the Barrett's occurs. The acid doesn't go all the way up here. The Barrett's is occurring way down here. So you only need to sample the cells where the Barrett's is going to occur. And then after you've covered that area, for the remainder of the trip out, the balloon is collapsed, the cells are in the capsule protected, and the sample is removed. And all of this, we say 5 minutes, but it's actually typically less than 5 minutes, 2 to 5 minutes. So here it is. The first is, then there is, even though this is a non-invasive office-based procedure, people sort of worry about their gag. It does require, sort of sitting upright and being calm and comfortable. There's usually a glass of water. The device is moistened, and the patient just typically will take a sip of water. Sometimes it helps to numb the back of the throat with a local anesthetic. And once it's in the back of the throat, they just swallow it like you're swallowing a pill. But the weird sensation is, of course, is that there's a tether to it with this sort of thin piece of spaghetti attached to it. And so with repeated swallows, it works its way down into the stomach, and we know that when it reaches about 50 centimeters. Once we know it's there, then the balloon is inflated, and it's pulled back until some resistance is felt, and that resistance is felt at that valve, at that juncture between the stomach and the esophagus. And then the clinician will pull back 5 centimeters from that point. So they know where their starting point is. They pull back 5 centimeters, so there are 2 inches. So you're only sampling you're getting a targeted sample of the 2 inches of the lower esophagus. Once you've covered that length, then they draw back and pull the balloon back into the capsule. So you can see the cells are in the inside now, and it's removed all the way out smoothly. And then at that point, it is reinflated and cut into a container. That container is packaged and sent by FedEx to the laboratory in California for processing. So you can see he's already had him swallow it. So as he's pulling back, that the 2 inches or so of the end of the esophagus, the cells are being swabbed, and then it gets pulled out with the balloon collapse, and it gets cut and put into the kit and sent to the laboratory.
And the whole thing takes about 5 minutes?
Actually, we say 5 minutes, but it's often less. A lot of it depends on sort of how anxious the patient is, or whether they're worried about their gag reflex, if you need to numb the back of the throat. But it can take as little as a couple minutes. One thing I can tell you is all of us in the company have actually had it, and it's really not that bad. And we actually we're starting to get some data for usability data from our clinical trial, where patients who've had endoscopies are commenting on sort of how easy it is to whether they'd recommend it, how is it compared to undergoing an endoscopy, and it's all playing out the way you would think, which is that it's much, much less invasive and involved, and the feedback from patients has been very good.
And I just want to mention, for folks who may be watching this on the recording, that info@luciddx.com is a place where they can send questions that they weren't able to ask during the webinar, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and also, if they want to find out what physicians in their area are offering this, or we're working through, we can help make those connections as well.
Okay.
So it's info@Lucid, LUCIDDX.com.
All right. So I have a question right off this top. When you're looking at that device coming down into that LES, the lower esophageal sphincter area, if a patient's already had perhaps a Nissen or a Lynx device installed, can you still use this technique to determine if they have Barrett's? What if you have a hiatal hernia? Is there any?
Same thing. It's the same thing. So in all of those situations, there still is a transition between the esophagus and the stomach. In the Nissen and Lynx example, the goal was obviously to tighten it, but it's not completely shut down. Otherwise you couldn't swallow, right? So it's a calibrated tightening. And so the same reason food can go down, the balloon will come back. And actually in those situations, it's fine, because what you need to be able to do is get that feedback that it catches a little bit at the LES, at the sphincter, and then you pull it through. The balloon is very soft, so it kind of conforms and sort of adjusts its shape to pull through the narrowing. A hiatal hernia can be a little bit more difficult, because the location can be higher than you expect, and sort of from a markings point of view, it requires a little bit more interpretation by the clinician in terms of where they are. We've actually moved towards having them inflate the balloon a little bit larger. If they don't feel it, they'll re-advance it and blow some extra air in the balloon, specifically for that situation where there's a hiatal hernia where the LES may not be as well defined. So at least you can feel some resistance as you get there, so you can know that you're sampling the correct 2 inches of esophagus.
And that really goes to the question one of the folks have submitted here, says, how accurate is the doctor able to place that balloon at the right place during the procedure?
Yeah, it's actually very accurate, and we have video where it's being deployed while an endoscopy is being performed, so you can actually see it pulled through, and you can actually tell how accurate it is. And let me just reiterate how we accomplish the accuracy, even though there's no imaging, right? You would think in order to be accurate that you would need to see what you're sampling. And that's the beauty of this technology, is it allows you to be accurate in your localization without actually seeing anything on a camera. And the reason is because we know at 50 centimeters, we know it's in the stomach. Okay, even the tallest, largest person, the distance from their teeth to the stomach is less than 50 centimeters. So as long as you advance it to 50 centimeters and blow the balloon up at that point, you know the balloon is in the stomach, right? So then at that point, when you pull back, there is a transition between the stomach and the esophagus. And you will feel that, the clinician will feel just a little tug at that point. The patient doesn't feel it because, again, we've had it. You don't really get much of a sensation there, but they'll feel, oh, okay, now I know that I'm at the juncture between the stomach and the esophagus. And then they note where the markings are and they say, okay, I'm supposed to pull back 5 centimeters from there. They pull back 5 centimeters, so they know they've swabbed those 5 centimeters. Then they deflate it, pull the cells into the capsule, and then remove it the rest of the way out. So the reason it's highly accurate is that even that the vast majority of patients, except for the examples that we described, people with hiatal hernias, with large, it's called patulous or sort of floppy sphincters, where the sphincter is just not there. That's a very small percentage of patients. It's likely in the single digits. The vast majority, 95% or greater, they have a good, well-formed G-junction. You can feel the balloon, and you can know that you've established a targeted sample. The other reason we know we're getting an accurate sample is that the test works. If you were not getting an accurate sample, and sometimes you were in the stomach, and sometimes you were in the mid or upper esophagus, the test would never work, because the test is only picking up abnormalities that are localized to that portion of the esophagus.
So before we get rid of this slide, I know you've already mentioned the highlighting by NIH of a significant advance funded by NCI, but can you tell us what the FDA and the Edison Award
Sure, yeah,
are here?
So the FDA granted this technology something called breakthrough device designation. And what that means is you have to, if you can prove to them, which we did, that you have a technology which can address and modify and improve the outcomes of a life-threatening or disabling condition, which obviously esophageal cancer is, that they granted this designation. And what that means is that it means two things. That one, we're in the process of doing a clinical trial, a large clinical trial, to demonstrate this efficacy beyond what the folks at Case Western did. And that the process of doing that and submitting that for FDA review is accelerated. You get all sorts of help from the FDA because they want to focus on their resources on technologies that they believe are breakthrough. The other important thing, and there's recent news on this, is that CMS or Medicare and Medicaid are accelerating payment determination for devices that have breakthrough designation. So that's another way that governmental agencies are trying to, encourage innovation for devices that are felt to be breakthrough. So that was a big deal.
And that's going to affect whether insurance covers this, essentially.
Right. Although it's a little bit complicated. So right now the test is available. It's commercially available as a laboratory developed test, and we received payment determination for that version of the test as a laboratory developed test, the way it's being marketed today, from CMS we received preliminary determination from CMS in June, and that payment will be active in January. Once CMS approves it, then generally you can get private payers to start paying for it. And so we've initiated discussions with private payers as a follow-up to the success we've had with CMS. One thing I forgot to highlight is that during this process where we're securing both governmental and private payer payment, the company is committed to providing this to patients without any out-of-pocket expense for the patient. So, so if this is, if there's a physician locally who's doing it, who's been trained, and the patient wants to get the test performed, we are not balance billing the patient at all. So, so we'll try to secure payment at the appropriate time as we negotiate with private payers, but the patients won't see that cost.
Okay. And then what was the Edison Award?
The Edison Award is that was a nice feather again in the cap of the inventors of this, which is the Edison Award is they're granted annually to technologies honoring Thomas Edison that are felt to be the most innovative technologies within that particular space that they're working within. So within the diagnostic technology space, EsoCheck, the balloon sampling device, was granted last year an Edison Award for being one of the most innovative products in that space. So we were happy to hear that.
So this question from Kathleen is esophageal adenocarcinoma always found in a Barrett segment? Do you know if there are possible ways for the development of EAC than the discussed non-dysplastic Barrett's esophagus dysplasia EAC sequence?
Yeah, excellent question. And the answer to that is we believe that 100% of esophageal adenocarcinoma arises from Barrett's. The vast majority of time, nearly 100% of the time, if a patient has esophageal cancer, when the pathologist looks at the specimen and they say, okay, here's the cancer, they see that the cancer occurs in a sea of Barrett's. There's Barrett's in other areas where that haven't developed in cancer. There are the occasional examples where the cancer is so advanced that it's sort of gone through everything and it's essentially gone through all the Barrett's. So you can't find any residual Barrett's precursor. But in those cases,
in my husband's case,
yeah, and in those cases,
Barrett's, but they assumed that he had.
Yeah, in those cases, you really have to assume it. It would be very odd to have to come up with a. We know how cancers work. They go through this phase. There's a precursor, dysplasia. We know those general mechanisms. So it would be very odd to have a large cancer sort of arise without having some other precursor that we were aware of. So for practical purposes, although we don't have 100% proof, you should assume that all esophageal adenocarcinoma arose from Barrett's, moved through at least some limited period of time through a dysplasia phase, and had the opportunity to be ablated before developed into cancer.
Yeah, and for years we've been, going to these conferences, and really there's never been any evidence of anything else that's been presented with any kind of authority on that. Right. The question that we received from another participant here says, given the extremely high cost of esophageal adenocarcinoma in lives, dollars, and human misery, it seems to this individual that endoscopic screening is more cost effective than is frequently acknowledged. And, there's, for those of us in this space, who've experienced this horrifying disease, many of our folks, and certainly when we started the organization, we thought, everyone needs to get a scope. But when we started, one of the things that we did was Dr. Yang, who is on our board of directors, a surgeon at Hopkins, did a study, not an official study, but, kind of a thumbnail study to see what if we looked at our patients who had reflux symptoms, and when they did their colonoscopy, check to see if they also, do an endoscopy. And what they did in terms of crunching the numbers, we figured that would definitely be cost effective. But really, at the end of the day, it didn't turn out to be. And that's because even though for those of us who've been through this, it doesn't feel like a rare cancer. Once you've been affected by it, it seems like 100 people who've had it. But the truth is, compared to colon cancer, lung cancer, all these other cancers, we are really a rare cancer?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think you hit on all the points, but I think there's more to it than that, right? I don't think the obstacle to people having, prior to the availability of these tests, getting an endoscopic screening was all cost. It really doesn't make sense because we do a ton of colonoscopies, and they've got comparable costs. I think it's a combination of what you said, which is sort of a lack of awareness. The and really education as much as cost. I think the primary care doctors are just not, patients don't know about this, are not demanding it, and primary care doctors are not well educated on this, despite obviously efforts by groups like yours. And their primary care doctors are generally loath to refer people for what are perceived to be invasive procedures. The bar is pretty high. Now with colonoscopy, that's reached all the way where the National Task Force has recommendations. And so, people are measured, they're literally, your payment could be determined on how well how successfully you're screening for doing mammography and colon. So all of those public health efforts have impacted that. And we never had the availability of that for upper endoscopy. But so I think that's why we're optimistic. Yes, we have a better tool, but that doesn't mean that we just sort of, throw it out there and everyone will do this. That a big part of our effort includes educating the GIs. I mean, many of the GIs don't even sort of fully appreciate, even for their own sort of financial interest of, okay, they want to be busy and do procedures, how big the funnel could be in terms of getting patients to come to them, and also the benefit of them not doing a lot of negative endoscopies, right? If your practice, you can only do so many endoscopies a day. If your practice was people who had already been screened and have a likelihood of being positive, and you're mostly there to identify the positives and put them into a regimen for monitoring, that's good for the gastroenterologist as well. So I think education will get us there. It'll certainly be a lot easier now that we have an office-based procedure.
And this has been something we've been looking for so long. And when we filed that petition with the FDA, one of the things we did to try to bolster our case was we hired a polling firm, Ipsos, which is internationally renowned for their work. And we did a survey of Americans to find out how many people knew that reflux disease could lead to cancer. And it's probably not surprising to you.
Right.
And it wasn't all that surprising to us to learn that it was only 14% of Americans
exactly
who knew
right.
that reflux could lead to cancer. And that's why, they take care of their symptoms and they think they're fine. And even people who are somewhat educated will think, well, if I'm taking my PPIs, then I'm fine. And truthfully, if you haven't been screened or scoped, you don't know if you're fine.
Correct.
And most folks don't understand that because we equate symptoms and risk.
You actually reminded me of one thing that's important to highlight, which is that 40% of esophageal cancer, we said that 100% of esophageal cancers for practical purposes occur in patients who have Barrett's esophagus, but 40% of those patients were asymptomatic.
Right.
So right now we're only targeting the symptomatic patients, although we've started some data collection, as I mentioned to you, to try to identify what group of asymptomatic patients should be screened, because even if we had 100% screening in symptomatic patients, we would be missing 40% of patients who don't have symptoms, presumably because they're taking PPIs and they're suppressing their symptoms.
Or they don't have symptoms. Because I will tell you, ironically, many years before my husband's diagnosis, I was a television and radio journalist, and I lost my voice. And I went to an ENT, and he stuck a scope down my nose, and he said, "You have heartburn?" I said, "No." He said, "I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, you have heartburn." I said, "I don't." And he said, "Well, the reason you can't talk is because the acid from your stomach is burning your vocal cords."
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you that was a shock to me.
Yep,
I took Nexium and my voice came back, but I had no idea at that time that condition could end up causing cancer.
Correct. Yeah. So there's a lot of education to do. I think that's the one lesson here.
So another question we have is, when will your new treatment become available? I guess it's not really a treatment, it's a test. And is it covered by insurance? And I think we've covered that.
So just to summarize,
picture of how people can access it.
So it is available now, and it is not yet covered by insurance, but we are providing the test, and we are committed to providing the test and submitting to insurance when insurance coverage becomes available, whether it's through Medicare or other payers. So from the patient's point of view, it's available. And so we just need to help. We're just getting started, and we just need to help people get connected with the appropriate clinicians who are getting up to speed and getting trained and offering it. But it is available across the country.
So, and if they go to that info at Lucid email address, you can link them up to a doctor who knows how to do, has access to it.
Yes.
And I guess we have another question. How many procedures does a clinician need to perform in order for patients to feel confident in their skill and their discrimination of the landmarks, particularly in patients with hiatal hernia?
Yeah. So this is actually a really simple procedure. I mean, we're very meticulous about training, and we have, lots of materials and protocols that we use to establish competency in this. But as someone who has spent a career teaching people how to do surgical procedures or other complex interventional procedures, this is a very simple procedure. In fact, it's mostly performed, almost exclusively performed by nurses, not by physicians. And we train people live. We train them to do it on each other, and sort of, I think the questioner highlighted really the only nuanced part of this. The rest of it is just, inflate, it's just sort of following a sequence of things, is that sensation that you are, that you're engaged at the lower esophageal sphincter. So that's really the qualitative part of it. The rest of it is really very systematic. And what we found is that altering the training and altering the procedural sequence so that if you don't quite feel it, going back and reinflating it to double the amount has worked, and people have been able to really feel it quite well. So all I can say, it's a very simple procedure. We've done it on each other. We train our sales reps, they do it on each other. This is not a complex procedure that requires a lot of training. And generally after one training session, they're ready to do it on their own. It doesn't require ongoing proctoring or anything like that.
We have a comment, not a question, but I'd like to read it just because it's completely how I feel about this. It says, "This device looks as though it could be a real game changer. I hope the awareness of it will quickly become widespread and that it will become widely adopted." And I think,
well, I think we agree. And flashback to January 2018 when we first saw this, it was clear that was the case. So we're very gratified that it's now getting out there and available to patients and their doctors.
So we had a question from somebody who said, if you already know that you have Barrett's, is there any utility in this test for you?
Likely not, but we're working on that. So if you think about it, the EsoCheck device is not specific to this assay. In theory, you can sample those cells and test them for whatever you want, right? And so we are working with both Case Western and other universities that are working on additional molecular diagnostic tests, and we're pretty close to having tests that can distinguish between Barrett's and dysplasia or cancer. They're so-called progression markers. So they would be a marker to say, okay, I have Barrett's. Now do I, now the goal is to pick up when my Barrett's, if my Barrett turns into dysplasia, so I can be ablated, right? And so we think in the hopefully in the not too distant future that we'll have the ability to marry the EsoCheck cell sampling device with another molecular assay diagnostic test that can detect that. And what that'll do is that will completely change the regimen for surveillance, right? Because right now you get your Barrett's, it's non-dysplastic. You say, okay, well, we'll do, every 3 years is the typical interval when you'd get another endoscopy. And there are, cancers don't grow in a linear line, right? So you will occasionally miss what's called an interval cancer, where someone starts at Barrett's, and by the time they get to their 3-year view, they've already gone through dysplasia and they have cancer. That explains why that 10% of patients with the statistic about 10% of patients with cancer, only 10% of patients with cancer have Barrett's. You might ask, well, what about the 10% who do have Barrett's? Why weren't they successfully monitored and ablated, right? And the reason is because they're only monitored every 3 years. Some might have been lost to follow-up. So if we can come up with if we can use the EsoCheck device in combination with a progression marker, you can imagine, since it's less invasive, having that done every year. Or in certain high-risk patients, having it done, let's say you have low grade, but you're not going to get ablated. You want to identify that transition, you could have it more frequently. So that's coming, but we don't have that yet right now, because it doesn't distinguish between the 4 different disease conditions. Once you have Barrett's, the surveillance regimen is endoscopy.
Boy, that would be a real, I mean, talk about a game changer. One of the
Yeah.
saddest stories that I remember in all the years of doing this work, we had a supporter who knew he had Barrett's, lost his job, didn't have insurance for a year, so he wasn't screened. When he finally had the funds and insurance to go back to the doctor, he had cancer.
Wow.
And those are the kinds of stories that you think, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
He never should have had to undergo that whole, luckily it was still fairly, early stage, but esophagectomy and all the changes it brings to your life. If there was a fairly inexpensive check that you could do,
right,
until we have a landscape where everybody gets insurance coverage, I think that, that's something that
it's expense, but it's also convenience, right? I mean, you can't really justify doing an endoscopy every year or more than every year, but you can justify doing a 5-minute office-based procedure every year. So it's a combination of those two benefits.
So we have a question from a woman who's on this call, and I have so many questions, she says, but she's going to start here. She's a 60-year-old woman with severe pain around her belly button and other issues such as GERD. I've stopped taking her medication about a month ago because of possible risk of dementia, according to her doctor. She took it again. She's feeling better, but the pain is still somewhat there. I'm getting a GI appointment, but my question is, what is the alternative if you have heartburn or Barrett's esophagus to these types of medications that mask the symptoms? And, that doesn't really go to the testing, but I think that, the issue here isn't necessarily the medications are bad.
No.
It's that you need to get checked before you start going off on the road of taking medications only.
Correct.
Right?
I think that's right. So I think in that, obviously, I'm sure there are lots of nuances to the story, but from what she described, I think she's doing the right thing to get it checked. Obviously, depending on what the endoscopy shows, if it shows Barrett's, then she needs to be followed up regularly, like we discussed. And during that follow-up, it's okay to take the medications, because you're not, the suppression is to suppress the symptoms of GERD. It doesn't suppress maybe it's important to make one clarification here, which may not be obvious, which is that the progression from Barrett's to cancer through dysplasia doesn't cause symptoms that are suppressed by PPIs, right? By the medication. So that's not the concern. The concern is when you have GERD and you have heartburn and you take the PPIs and you suppress it, but don't get checked. If you're high risk, then you have no reason to get checked because you're not having symptoms. I think hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's what we've seen so often, folks whose doctor just, and it's something with the issue you raised with primary care physicians. They're seeing so many patients, tons of them have heartburn. The easiest thing for them to do is write them a prescription. And after a while, the patient, once their symptoms are gone, they don't bring it up again. Yeah. It's not in their mind, and they don't know whether that patient has had 5 years of GERD, because the patient hasn't come back to say it. And we had a board member whose life was saved because, and this is, I think, an important point. He was at his physical, and his doctor said, well, do you have reflux, heartburn? And he said, well, I did, but it went away. And the doctor sent him immediately for an endoscopy. And this is something that not a lot of folks always understand, but with Barrett's, sometimes your symptoms go away because what's happening there is the lining of your esophagus is changing to be more like the lining of your stomach, right?
Correct, yeah.
Your stomach doesn't feel that acid, and so then your esophagus doesn't feel it anymore either.
That's a great point. Like I was saying, it's sort of like the esophagus is trying to accommodate and protect itself, and the act of doing so, it can make the symptoms, the symptoms can resolve. So I think that's, I think that's right.
So someone asked me a personal question. Mindy, given your past reflux diagnosis, have you done it yet? And I will tell you, I haven't, but I will tell you that I've had the TNE, the transnasal
Right.
esophagoscopy, twice now. And so I have to assume that this is going to be less difficult to do
Yeah, it
than the
is.
TNE.
And
And
then
that wasn't so bad.
yeah, and the issue with the TNE is just visualization, right? So all you see is what I showed in that picture, which is you see the salmon colored mucosa and you say, okay, there's Barrett's, but the visualization is not perfect. That's why you do biopsies. That's why you need a tissue or cellular diagnosis. And so so we think this is superior to TNE, both because it's less invasive, but also because we're actually getting a sample, which is usually not the case with TNA.
One comment from Sharon says, it's not a question, but I just wanted to tell you, Dr. Aklog, thank you and your team for doing such a great job. And
thank you. Labor of love.
so this is, I would say that because this is really a patient-focused webinar, we might not ask this question, but I do think this is an important question because it goes to the profitability of your company. And while on one level, we're not here to try and make you rich, doctor, no offense, but the truth is that if your company isn't successful, then we're not going to have these tests for our patients. Correct. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you this question. Sure. Is your company expecting any meaningful revenue by the end of this year?
That sounds like an investor joining this call. So we're a public company. We don't provide guidance on revenue. What we've said is that we have, after a period of time when COVID had shut down all non-emergency procedures, that starting in mid-August or so, non-emergency procedures have picked up. They've picked up quite rapidly. We're very happy with the interactions we're having with gastroenterologists and the procedures, the acceleration of procedures that have been performed even over the last 3 to 4 weeks. So we expect to see increased procedural volume. When that will be recognized as revenue is complicated, and that it'll require completion of a lot of the activities that I'd mentioned on the reimbursement side, the code being finalized for payment and other matters. So we will have a code effective January 1st, and that will be a starting point for some of that. But in terms of the utilization, we're very optimistic, and we're very happy with how things are proceeding as the COVID's not going away, but as the shutdown of non-elective procedures related to COVID is opening up. We've been very gratified with how the adoption and the trajectory of the adoption. So I'll leave it at that.
And this may be, you may have already answered this question, but I'll go ahead and put it out there. As far as market penetration and commercial growth, what is the vision for EsoGuard once it receives IVD approval? So, is there anything else you'd want to say about that?
Yeah, IVD approval, just to let everybody know, is an in vitro diagnostic. It was that kind of subtle distinction I was trying to skirt around earlier, which is right now the test is being offered as a laboratory developed test because it's performed at a central laboratory, but we're also performing a clinical study that will be completed by the end of next year, that will submit to the FDA for a formal registration as an in vitro diagnostic. Now, I don't have time to go into why we do that. There's a certain strategy around that in terms of our ability to market certain things more aggressively. We're also just looking forward to getting that data. We are confident that the trajectory for market penetration on the laboratory developed test, well before we get IVD in vitro diagnostic FDA registration in 2022, will be substantial, because we're not really limited right now as an LDT in terms of how we can talk to physicians and patients. We'll have some loosening of restrictions on that once we get the IVD, but right now it's not a limiting factor for us. So it's simply about getting the word out, educating primary docs, getting gastroenterologists and their teams trained, building and expanding our sales channel, which is growing rapidly. So there's plenty of run room for penetrating and for getting procedural volume to grow well before we expect the IVD process to be completed in 2022.
So we have a question from someone who wants to know if you're able to provide any idea of cost And I guess what you've said is before there's any insurance coverage, patients would not suffer any
Correct. Yeah.
financial burden for this. But
Yep.
if it is covered by insurance, would there be out of cost? I guess it would be based on your insurance.
That's something we'll look into. We're really committed to having patients have the opportunity to receive this. I mean, that is what drives us. Routine out of pocket, routine sort of co-payments and things like that may be covered, but we'll work with individual doctors and individual patients to make sure that patient cost is not a deterrent to them getting the test. So we're absolutely committed to that, both in this early interval while we're working to lock down payment and coverage from Medicare and other payers, but even beyond that's part of our commitment.
Another question is this test primarily being conducted at the gastroenterologist's office, or is it available from the primary care physicians?
So what we've decided, this could be performed in a primary care physician office because it doesn't require any particular technical expertise. We've made a strategic decision to start with the gastroenterologist because they know this disease. This is in their space, and they're the ones who are going to follow up with the endoscopies and do the surveillance and so forth. So we've decided to start with them, and we also want to make sure that people are doing enough procedures so that it becomes comfortable and rapid and efficient, right? So if you've got a gastroenterologist, you can imagine, them having an entire day where their nurse is doing 50 of these in a day, right? As opposed to a solo primary care physician who may only, order this half a dozen times a year. There is sort of a middle step, which is that a lot of primary care and internal medicine now is being consolidated into large groups. So we have had conversations, and we are definitely will pursue sort of in a large group practice where they would designate one resource amongst multiple doctors to perform it in a internal medicine primary care setting. I think it's going to be a while before we would be where we would offer this at sort of solo practice individual. It just doesn't make sense. It just makes more sense for that practitioner to order the test and to have it done at somewhere where it's being performed much more regularly. That's our current plan.
And one of the things we've seen occurring more recently now is so many places starting to open heartburn centers.
Right. Exactly.
So where you've got the GI doc, but also folks who come in with more low, what you would perceive as more low-level symptoms, right, but this heartburn, and you would hope
that's a good example. Oh, absolutely. So that would be one obvious example of a consolidated center where you can have a high throughput and have lots of procedures being performed in a more efficient way. So certainly those centers would be are places we're targeting.
So I want to say to folks who are among our advocacy and patient, caregiver, family member groups, one of the things that ECAN is really dedicated to, and we have been since our founding, is raising awareness. And, for us, it's always been difficult because until now, we couldn't say there was, what's the call to action? Go get an endoscopy. Not everybody can get an endoscopy. We know that now. So now we have something that could really make a difference. Once we raise that awareness, we can say to folks there, and this isn't the only, easy test. This is the first one that's really going to become widely available. And so we feel like we're right on the precipice of making a huge difference in this disease. And there's a role you can play. So when you start raising awareness in your communities among the doctors, among the patients, the family members, all of these folks, and we have resources available to help you do that. We, last year when we started realizing that these new early detection devices were coming on board, we started something we call now Stacy's Army, because we thought, we don't have a lot of resources. I can't afford to buy ads on TV, but we certainly have a lot of folks who care about it, and it takes an army to win the war. So we're going to ask you to enlist, and we'll provide you with a lot of tools to help you raise awareness. And that's one of the ways, I think, because we now have these tests, that we really can win this war.
There really aren't any other tests that are available. Let's just make a quick
No, none are available now.
Yeah, they're working their way through. There are the sponges, but the sponge technologies are not yet married to a test that is
There's
sufficiently
nothing
accurate
easily available, but there's several,
that are
folks
working their way through. Just
down
wanted
the
to make,
road
yeah,
that we expect to see coming on board soon, but or relatively soon, but they're not yet there. And so
yeah,
we're very excited about this, but we feel like now we're at the point where we can say to folks, there
yeah,
is a test. You can
yep,
go get it. Once you know you have heartburn and are concerned, there's
yep,
something you can do.
correct.
So there's another question here. Someone says, are you pursuing the utilization of EsoCheck for other applications outside of Barrett's and dysplasia and cancer?
Yes, so we are pursuing it for a condition called esophageal eosinophilic esophagitis, which many people haven't heard of, but they should have heard of because most people have heard of inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, and EOE, or eosinophilic esophagitis, has nearly the same prevalence as it. So it's an inflammatory, allergy-mediated, very debilitating condition, inflammation of the esophagus, that can be diagnosed by looking for a particular type of cell. And we think right now, we talk about how inconvenient it would be to have an endoscopy once a year for your Barrett's. People with EOE will often have 20 endoscopies in a year because it's very difficult to monitor the progression, the response to therapy just based on symptoms. So to properly treat these patients, they have to have the ability to have repeated sampling. So we have a clinical trial underway right now at the University of Pennsylvania that is enrolling patients to use the EsoCheck sampling device for that particular condition. We're also looking at infectious conditions of the esophagus, fungal infections, things that happen in HIV patients, in bone marrow transplant patients, other immunocompromised patients. There are a variety of infectious conditions that we think we can diagnose with our tool without an endoscopy. It's a great question.
Can you tell folks what the symptoms of EOE are?
Symptoms of EOE are it's funny. So symptoms of EOE are often confused with GERD. So similar types of pain, swallowing, pain on swallowing, difficulty swallowing, and there's actually may even be some biologic overlap where there's some commonality, but they are quite distinct. But it's actually not. It can be confused. It can be confused for GERD.
And there's a question from one of our attendees about whether this test can detect squamous cell carcinoma.
So
which is
no,
a type of esophageal cancer.
Right. So we haven't talked about squamous cell. Squamous cell is another type of esophageal cancer. Historically, it was actually the more common type, but now it's been blown away by the rise of adenocarcinoma.
In the Western world, yeah.
In the Western world, right. And it's much more common in Asia. And no, the assay, the test is specific to Barrett's. The device could. We just don't have good molecular diagnostic tests yet for squamous cell carcinoma. So the answer is that there is no. We'd love to have one that we could marry to the sampling device, to the cell collection device, but none are yet available.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for submitting your questions, for participating, for joining us today, and Dr. Aklog, especially to you for taking the time to share all of this exciting information with us. And we agree that we think this could be a really big game changer, and we hope that all of us in the ECAN family can help to make sure that that's what happens, because there's nothing more important to us than saving the lives of folks who are at risk for esophageal cancer. I want to read one more comment, and it really kind of sums up, I guess, what folks are feeling. It says, this has been very well done, as well as very informative, and they want to thank you. So I thank you very much, and we will be sharing the information that you've shared here. It'll be available widely. So if you've seen this and you think other folks may want to see it, it'll be available on the ECAN website. We'll be sending out the links to the folks who registered on Zoom. It's available on our Facebook page, and we'll be providing updates as more things happen in the future. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mindy. This has been great. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for all you do. Thanks for everybody on this call for being committed to this cause, because as you said, it's extremely important, and we're excited about the opportunities available to all of us to move the needle on this. So thanks for the opportunity. It's been enjoyable and great questions.
Thank you very much.
Okay, take care.
Everybody have a good day.
Bye-bye.